Just before midnight, my husband placed a thick stack of papers in front of me, his eyes red with caffeine and arrogance. He told me to sign if I loved him. I smiled, feigning weakness, and pushed back a minor revision containing a single formula to make things fair. He signed without reading, believing he had secured his fortune. He never realized that at 1 minute past midnight, one calculation error had transferred a billion-dollar empire directly to me. My name is Harper Jackson. I am 34 years old, and in the sterile, climate-controlled air of the Manhattan penthouse I shared with my husband, I was currently worth less than the potted orchid sitting on the corner of my desk. The digital clock on the wall silently flipped to 11:54 at night. Outside the floor-to-ceiling glass, New York City was a grid of golden electricity, a living, breathing machine of ambition and avarice. Inside, the room was silent enough to hear the hum of the server tower in the closet. I sat in my glass-walled office, the light from my monitor painting my face in a pale, ghostly blue. I was a senior contract analyst at Cinder Lake Legal Analytics. My job, day in and day out, was to find the trapdoors in corporate mergers, the tiny, microscopic fractures in billion-dollar deals that could bring a company to its knees. But tonight, the contract in front of me was not for a client. The heavy oak door swung open, slamming against the stopper with a violence that made the glass walls shudder. Howard walked in. Howard West, my husband, the founder of West Meridian Ventures, a self-made billionaire who had convinced half of Silicon Valley that he could predict the future. He looked like a wreck, albeit an expensive one. He had just returned from a fundraising gala at the Met. His tuxedo jacket was gone, discarded somewhere in the hallway. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing a flush of skin reddened by expensive scotch and the adrenaline of closing deals. His eyes were bloodshot, red veins swimming in the whites, fueled by caffeine and that specific, intoxicating arrogance that comes from having everyone in a room laugh at your jokes. He did not say hello. He did not ask why I was still awake. He simply marched to my desk and dropped a thick, bound document onto the glass surface. The sound was heavy, like a dead bird hitting a window. Just a few small adjustments. "Harper," he said, his voice rough, "if you still love me, you will sign it." I looked down at the cover page. It was a post-nuptial agreement, formatted to look like an amendment to our original prenuptial agreement from 7 years ago. Howard paced the room, running a hand through his thinning hair. "We are filing for the second IPO next week," he said, talking to the air rather than to me. "The valuation of the company has shifted. My lawyers advise that we need to update the domestic asset protection clauses. It is just a formality, standard procedure to protect the volatility of the share price." I reached out and opened the document. My fingers were steady. I had been expecting this. I flipped through the pages, my eyes scanning the dense legal blocks of text with the speed of a machine. I did not need to read every word to know what this was. I knew the structure, I knew the rhythm of the language, and I knew exactly where the knife was hidden, the original prenup, signed 7 years ago when I was a naive paralegal from Michigan and he was just a promising millionaire, had a sunset clause. If we divorced after 7 years, the fixed payout cap was supposed to expire, and I would be entitled to an equitable distribution of marital assets. Tonight was 2 days before our 7th anniversary. This new document did not just update the terms, it obliterated them. It reset the clock. It defined all his current holdings in West Meridian Ventures and the upcoming IPO as separate property, forever out of my reach. If I signed this, and if he divorced me a week later, I would walk away with a fixed lump sum that amounted to less than the cost of the catering for the gala he had just attended. I looked up at him. He was pouring himself a drink from the crystal decanter on the sidebar, his back to me. "Howard," I said, keeping my voice level, "this strips me of everything. The original agreement said that after 7 years, we were partners. This returns me to an employee status." He spun around, glass in hand, ice clinking against the crystal. "Don't be dramatic. Harper," he snapped, "you have a roof over your head. You have an allowance. You have a life most women would kill for. But this is business. This is my empire. I built it. I need to make sure it stays intact. He took a long swallow of the amber liquid and walked closer, leaning over the desk, invading my space. Ideally, I would have stepped back, but I held my ground. I need you to sign it now, he said. Before midnight. Why midnight, I asked, though I knew. Because the new fiscal quarter starts at 12:01 in the morning. He lied smoothly. The auditors need the liability disclosure cleared before the books open for the IPO roadshow. If you do not sign, Harper, I have to take measures to protect the fund. Measures I asked. I will have to freeze the joint credit accounts, he said, his tone bored, as if he were ordering lunch. I will have to recall the preferred stock allocated to your name for tax purposes. We will essentially be roommates, partners in residence only. He checked his watch. It was a Patek Philippe, worth more than my father's house. You have 4 minutes, he said. I looked at him, really looked at him. 7 years. I had organized his life, managed his schedule, smoothed over his social faux pas, and read every single contract he was too lazy to review. I had stood in the shadows while he stood in the spotlight, and now he was looking at me not as his wife, but as a liability on a spreadsheet that needed to be zeroed out. A wave of cold clarity washed over me. He expected me to cry. He expected me to beg. He expected the girl from the industrial town in Michigan to be terrified of losing the golden ticket. I let my lower lip tremble. It was a small muscle movement, practiced in the mirror. I let my shoulders slump, shrinking myself into the silhouette of a defeated woman. So that is it, I asked, my voice dropping to a whisper. All the years I stood behind you, all the sacrifices, they are just worth a new PDF file at midnight. Howard rolled his eyes and sighed, a sound of performative exhaustion. You are being too sensitive. Harper, he said. This is why you never understood the world of high finance. You let emotions cloud the data. Just sign the papers. I looked down at the document again. My mind was racing, but not with panic. It was racing with precision. I had spent months waiting for him to make a move like this. I knew he was hiding assets. I knew he was preparing to discard me for a newer, shinier model once the IPO billions were secured. But he had made a mistake. He was arrogant. He thought he was the smartest person in the room because he was the loudest. I took a deep breath, shaky and audible. Okay, I said, I will sign. He exhaled, his posture relaxing instantly. Good girl. But, I added, picking up a pen, the formatting on page 14 and the schedule references in the appendix are messy. You know I cannot sign a contract that looks like it was drafted by a first-year associate. It bothers me. Howard scoffed. It was drafted by the best firm in the city. They missed a definition alignment on the equity vesting clause. I lied effortlessly. It creates a circular reference. If the auditors see that, they will flag it. Let me just clean up the language. I will not change the numbers. I promise. I just want it to be clean. He looked at the clock. 11:58 at night. He was tired. He was drunk. And he was so convinced of his own superiority that the idea of me outsmarting him was a biological impossibility in his mind. Fine. He waved his hand dismissively. Clean up the grammar. Just do not touch the valuation figures. And hurry up. I pulled the document toward me. I did not use the computer. I used the pen, making interlineations in the margins. Standard legal practice for last-minute changes. I corrected a few actual typos to make it look legitimate. Then, I turned to the critical section. The clause defined the excluded assets, the money I could not touch. It referenced Schedule A, which was a list of all his companies and trusts. With a steady hand, I drew a line through a sentence that seemed redundant. Then, I added a small, handwritten note at the bottom of the paragraph. For the purposes of equity calculation under this section, the definition of net asset value shall be determined in accordance with the formula set forth in Schedule B. Notwithstanding any prior fixed exclusions, it looked like legal gibberish, it looked like housekeeping, but Howard had forgotten what was in Schedule B. Schedule B was a dormant list of shared liabilities and joint ventures that we had set up years ago for tax deductions. It was currently empty. By linking the valuation of his empire to the formula in Schedule B, a formula that I swiftly adjusted in the margin to include all global holdings vested or unvested as the baseline for the joint calculation, I had effectively inverted the exclusion. Instead of his assets being excluded from me, the new clause mathematically pulled all his assets into the joint bucket the moment the clock struck midnight and the new fiscal period began. It was a logic bomb, a paradox in ink. I blew softly on the wet ink to dry it. "There," I said, sliding the heavy stack back across the glass. "It reads better now." Howard did not even look at the page. He did not check the reference. He did not ask what Schedule B contained. He just saw the signature line. He uncapped his Mont Blanc fountain pen. The nib scratched loudly against the paper. A harsh, tearing sound in the quiet room. He signed his name with a flourish, a signature he had practiced for autograph seekers. He checked the clock. 11:59 at night. "Done," he said, closing the folder with a thump. "You made the right choice." "Harper." He looked at me with a pitying smile, the kind a master gives to a loyal dog. "I am going to bed," he said. "Don't stay up too late. We have a brand to maintain tomorrow." He turned and walked out of the office, leaving the door open. I sat there in silence. I listened to his footsteps fade down the hallway, followed by the soft click of the bedroom door closing. I looked at the document sitting under the pool of light from my desk lamp. The ink on his signature was drying, turning from a wet sheen to a permanent matte black. I reached out and touched the paper. It felt cold. Howard thought he had just locked me out of his fortune. He thought he had bought his freedom for pennies on the dollar. He had gone to sleep believing he was the king of the world. I glanced at the digital clock. The numbers shifted. It's midnight. Then, 12:01 in the morning. The day had changed. The fiscal quarter had begun. The contract was now live. I picked up the document and held it to my chest. My heart was beating a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. I was not afraid. I was not sad. I felt a strange, cold exhilaration, like standing on the edge of a cliff and realizing you are the one who controls the wind. You did not just sign a prenup. "Howard," I whispered to the empty room. I opened the document to the page he had ignored. Tracing the line I had written, the formula was simple, elegant, and catastrophic for him. By the time his expensive lawyers realized what that cross-reference meant, by the time they did the math, it would be too late. He had valued his empire at billions. He had valued me at zero. But in the language of contracts, a zero in the wrong place changes everything. I opened my drawer and placed the document inside, engaging the biometric lock. He had just signed away the kingdom, and he did not even have the courtesy to read the fine print. 7 years is a long time in a human life, but in the world of contract law, it is merely a vesting period. To understand why I did what I did at midnight, you have to understand who I was 7 years ago. I was not the woman sitting in a Manhattan penthouse wearing silk that cost more than my father's car. Back then, I was Harper from a mid-sized industrial town in Michigan, a place where the sky was perpetually gray and success was defined by holding down a job at the auto plant for 30 years. I had clawed my way out, scholarship by scholarship, until I landed in New York City as a paralegal. I spent my days swimming in an ocean of paperwork, reading the fine print for corporate giants who would never know my name. I met Howard at a startup conference in Brooklyn. It was one of those events where the air smelled of stale coffee and desperate ambition. He was not a billionaire then. He was just a millionaire, which in New York is a distinction that actually matters. He was wearing a hoodie that had seen better days and speaking passionately about algorithmic efficiency. I was the only person in the room who actually read the release forms they were handing out at the door. That was what caught his eye. He liked that I was careful. He liked that I understood the rules. We fell in love quickly, or at least, I did. Howard fell in love with the idea of having someone competent to manage the parts of his life that bored him. 6 months later, he proposed, but the ring came with a rider. He sat me down in his bachelor apartment, which was littered with server racks and empty takeout boxes, and told me he did not believe in marriage without a clear exit strategy. I build things. Harper, he had said, looking at me with those intense, calculating eyes, and I need to know that what I build is safe. It is not about us. It is about work. He presented the prenuptial agreement the next day. I read it. I was a professional. After all, it was a brutal document. It stated that all assets acquired before the marriage were his sole property. That was standard. But it also stipulated that any growth of those assets and any new companies formed under the umbrella of his intellectual property would remain 100% his. In the event of a divorce, I would not get a share of the empire. Instead, I would receive a fixed payout, a flat fee, like a severance package for a terminated employee. At 27 years old, staring at the man I thought was my soulmate, I did not see a trap. I saw honesty. I prided myself on my own independence. I had my own career at Cinder Lake Legal Analytics. I was going to be a high-powered consultant. I did not need his money. I told myself that contracts were just paper, and we were flesh and blood. I told myself that if we stayed together forever, the exit clause would never matter. So I signed. I signed it with a flourish, thinking I was proving that I loved him for him, not his bank account. I was so young, and I was so incredibly stupid. Over the next 7 years, the world shifted beneath our feet. Howard launched Neon Harbor Labs. The application he built revolutionized consumer fintech. It went from a useful tool to a global necessity. We moved from the messy apartment to a condo in Tribeca, and then to the penthouse in Manhattan. We bought the house in the Hamptons. We bought the private jet, a Gulfstream that cost more to fuel for a single trip than my parents earned in a decade. Howard transformed. The hoodie was replaced by bespoke suits. The desperate ambition turned into an icy, untouchable confidence. He became a titan, a visionary, and I became the wife, despite my job, despite my promotions at Cinder Lake, despite the fact that I was managing complex legal audits for Fortune 500 companies. In Howard's world, I was just a detail. I was the woman who made sure the dinner parties ran on time. To his billionaire friends, I was background noise. I saw the way they looked at me at galas. They saw a woman who had gotten lucky. They called me intelligent in that patronizing tone people use when they are surprised you can speak in complete sentences. They whispered that I was the paralegal who married the boss, even though I had never worked for him, but the real change happened inside the house. Our conversations stopped being about dreams or our day. They became briefings. Howard would come home, pour a drink, and talk to me. He talked about valuation caps. He talked about Series B funding rounds. He talked about the sharks coming for his equity. You have to understand. Harper, he would say, staring out at the city lights, never looking at me. Everyone wants a piece of me. If I do not ring-fence every dollar, they will bleed me dry. Initially, I nodded, thinking he was venting about competitors, but slowly, I realized he was not just talking about other companies. He was talking about everyone, including me. He started bringing up the prenup in casual conversation. It became a shield he wore around the house. If I asked for a renovation on the kitchen, he would joke about how it was a capital improvement on his asset. If we argued about his travel schedule, he would remind me that his work paid for the roof over my head. The distance between us grew so wide you could park his private jet in it. I was no longer his partner. I was a potential liability. I was a risk factor that had been mitigated by a PDF file stored on his cloud server. I remember one specific night about 6 months ago. We were at a dinner with his board members. One of them, a man named Sterling, made a joke about how expensive divorces were in New York. Howard laughed. A loud, barking laugh. "Not for me," Howard said, swirling his wine. "I have the tightest paper in the city. My wife knows exactly what she is worth. It is all in black and white." The table laughed with him. I sat there, freezing, a smile plastered on my face like a mask. He had just reduced our entire marriage. All the nights I held him when he was stressed. All the years I managed his life so he could focus on his code. To a line item. He was telling them that he had already won the negotiation of our life together. That was the moment the love finally died. It did not go out with a bang. It just suffocated under the weight of his ego. I went to work the next day, but I could not focus. I kept hearing his voice. My wife knows exactly what she is worth. I realized then that there are two ways to react when the man you love starts talking about you like a number on a spreadsheet. You can cry, you can scream, you can beg for him to see you as a human being, or you can open Excel and check the formulas. You can stop being the wife and start being the contract analyst he forgot you were. I went home early that day. The penthouse was empty. The housekeeper had already left. It was a mausoleum of white marble and chrome, beautiful and cold. I made myself a cup of tea, standing in the kitchen that cost $200,000. I opened my laptop and logged into our shared secure drive. I found the file. West Jackson Prenuptial Agreement Final Signed, PDF. I sat there for hours, reading. I did not read it like a wife looking for reassurance. I read it like a shark. I read it like I was reviewing a hostile takeover bid for a client. I highlighted every clause. I cross-referenced every definition. I looked for the ambiguity. I looked for arrogance. And I found a weakness. The original prenup was strict. Yes, but it was written for a millionaire, not a billionaire. It relied on fixed definitions of assets that had since evolved into complex holding companies and offshore trusts. It was a sturdy cage, but the beast inside had outgrown it. Howard believed it was ironclad because he believed he was untouchable. He thought that because he had the money, he made the rules. But rules are made of words, and words are my currency. As I sat there in the fading light of the afternoon, the sun dipping below the Hudson River, I felt a shift in my chest. The sadness that had been weighing me down for years evaporated. It was replaced by something sharper, something cold and hard, like the diamond on my finger. He wanted a business arrangement, fine. I would give him the best business arrangement of his life. I closed the laptop and took a sip of my tea. It had gone cold, but I drank it anyway. I looked around the kitchen, at the appliances I rarely used, at the view I rarely enjoyed. I knew then that I was going to take it. Not because I was greedy, not because I wanted the money. I was going to take it because he thought I couldn't. That evening, when he came home, I didn't confront him. I didn't ask for a divorce. I asked him how his day was. I smiled. I played the part of the supportive, non-threatening wife. I became the mirror he wanted to see, reflecting his own greatness back at him. All the while, I was waiting. I knew the 7-year mark was approaching. I knew his advisors would tell him to update the contract before the new IPO. I knew he would come to me with a new stack of papers, expecting me to sign blindly just like the 27-year-old girl from Michigan had done. He underestimated one thing. He forgot that while he was building a fortune, I was building a skill set. He forgot that in a war of words, the person holding the pen is the most dangerous person in the room. So when he walked in tonight, red-eyed and arrogant, demanding my signature before midnight, he thought he was closing a loophole. He didn't know he was walking into a guillotine. I looked at my reflection in the darkened window of the kitchen. I didn't look like a victim anymore. I looked like a partner, a silent partner. And as anyone in business knows, the silent partners are the ones you have to watch out for. The first sign that my husband was leaving me was not a lipstick stain on a collar or a mysterious scent of perfume. It was a watch. For the first 5 years of our marriage, Howard wore a digital fitness tracker. He claimed it was about efficiency, about optimizing his sleep cycles and heart rate variability. Then, seemingly overnight, the plastic band was replaced by a Patek Philippe Nautilus with a blue dial. It was a watch that cost more than the student loans I had just finished paying off. It was a statement piece, the kind of heavy, brushed steel that says the wearer's time is more valuable than anyone else's in the room. Next came the suits. The hoodies and jeans that had defined his disrupting the industry aesthetic vanished. In their place came bespoke Italian wool, tailored within an inch of its life to make his shoulders look broader and his waist slimmer. He started using phrases like personal branding and optical dominance. He stopped looking like the brilliant, messy coder I had fallen in love with and started looking like every other shark swimming in the deep end of Manhattan finance. He began attending the circuit, that is what they call it in New York. the endless loop of charity galas, art auctions, and Davos summits. In the beginning, I went with him. I stood by his side in gowns that made it hard to breathe, smiling until my jaw ached, holding his arm while he charmed potential investors. But slowly, the invitations changed. "Harper, you would be bored," he would say, adjusting his silk tie in the mirror. "This is really just a working dinner. Just the executive team and a few key stakeholders. You stay home. Order that sushi you like." I stopped being his plus one. I became the woman who waited at home while he built his legacy. It was in an email forwarded by mistake that I first saw her name. Howard was terrible at email hygiene. He often forwarded long chains to me asking me to print attachments or summarize documents, forgetting to check the history at the bottom. The subject line was harmless Q3 operational roadmap. But halfway down the chain, buried under a discussion about server migration, was a message from a sender named Lila Mercer. "The yacht is secured for the offsite in Miami. Just the executive team. No spouses. We need total focus if we are going to crush the competition. Can't wait to brainstorm with you on the deck at midnight. Best, L. Lila Mercer." I typed her name into the search bar of my laptop. She was the new Chief Operating Officer of Neon Harbor Labs. I expected a 20-something assistant. What I found was a woman who looked like a gladiator in a pencil skirt. She was in her early 40s, with sharp cheekbones, ice blonde hair cut in a severe bob, and eyes that looked like they could evaluate your net worth in 3 seconds. She had an MBA from Wharton and a reputation for ruthlessness. She was beautiful, yes, but in a cold, terrifying way. She looked like the female version of who Howard was trying to become. From that day on, I started noticing the pattern. Howard's text messages to me became functional. Late, meeting, don't wait up. Meanwhile, his calendar, which synced to the family iPad in the kitchen, was a mosaic of meetings with Lila, breakfast briefings at the St. Regis, strategy sessions in Aspen, late-night crisis management calls that required him to step out onto the balcony and close the glass door. I tried to talk to him about it. I did not approach it as a jealous wife. I approached it as a risk analyst. "Howard," I said one evening while he was packing for a conference in London, "Lila is going with you again." He did not look up from his suitcase. "Obviously. She is the COO. I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "You know, the board might see the frequency of your private travel with her as a governance issue. If there is even a perception of impropriety between a CEO and his second-in-command, it can trigger a shareholder lawsuit. It is a conflict of interest risk." Howard stopped folding his shirt. He turned to me, and for a second, I saw pure contempt in his eyes. "Harper," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "you are thinking like a paralegal again. Stop looking for problems in the fine print. This is how the big leagues operate. Lila and I are building an empire. We are not having a scandalous affair in the supply closet. You really do not understand my world. Do you?" I swallowed the lump in my throat. He had dismissed my professional expertise, the very thing that had drawn him to me in the first place, as the paranoid ramblings of a low-level employee. He left for London an hour later. He left his iPad on the kitchen island, logged in. I did not snoop. I audited. I opened his email app. I did not read the romantic poetry, because there was none. Howard was not a poet. He was a transactional narcissist. What I found was far more damning in a court of law. I found receipts. I found hotel invoices for the Ritz in Paris, where 2 rooms were booked, but only 1 room service bill was generated, listing breakfast for 2. I found emails where he shared confidential board materials with her before the rest of the directors saw them, accompanied by notes like, "You are the only one who gets it." I took screenshots. I forwarded them to a secure, encrypted server that I had set up years ago, separate from our family cloud. I labeled the folder Project Mercer. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night in November. I was sitting on the white sofa in our living room, eating cold pad thai from a cardboard box. On the massive flat-screen television, I was watching the live stream of the Global FinTech Innovation Awards. Howard was receiving the Visionary of the Year award. He looked magnificent on stage, bathed in the blue spotlight. He held the crystal trophy high. The applause thundering through the speakers. He thanked his investors. He thanked his parents. And then, he looked out into the front row. "I want to dedicate this award to the person who has been my rock," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The person who challenges me, who pushes me to be better, and who understands the sacrifice required to change the world. My partner in every sense of the word, Lila. This is for you." The camera cut to the audience. Lila Mercer stood up. She was wearing a silver gown that looked like liquid mercury. She did not smile. She beamed with the pride of ownership. She blew him a kiss. He did not mention me. The woman who had edited his first pitch decks, who had nursed him through panic attacks when the servers crashed in the early days, who had signed away her financial future to prove her love. I was not even a footnote. I sat there in the silence of the penthouse, holding my chopsticks. Most women would have thrown the wine glass at the television. Most women would have cried until their mascara ran down their face. I did not cry. I felt a cold, metallic click in my brain. It was the sound of a switch flipping. I picked up my phone. I rewound the live stream. I opened my screen recording app. I captured the entire speech in high-definition 4K resolution. I saved it to the folder. I am not at the age to break wine glasses. I said to the empty room, I am at the age to capture 4K evidence. The next morning, I met Naomi Rhodes for coffee at a small, nondescript cafe in Brooklyn, far away from the prying eyes of Howard's circle. Naomi was a divorce attorney who ate hedge fund managers for breakfast. She had been my friend since law school. She watched the video on my phone, her expression grim. "He is publicly acknowledging her as his partner," Naomi said, handing the phone back to me. "That is humiliation, Harper. But legally, it is also an admission of alienation of affection, depending on the jurisdiction." I showed her the financial records I had gathered, the dinners, the flights. "He is getting sloppy," I said. "He thinks he is untouchable." Naomi leaned in, her voice dropping. "Harper, listen to me. If he has started mixing his emotional life with his power base, the next step is inevitable. Men like Howard do not just have affairs. They restructure. He is going to try to secure his assets before he makes a move to leave you. He is going to come for the prenup." I felt a chill run down my spine. It was the confirmation of my worst fear. "He keeps talking about protecting the company." I said, "About ring-fencing the IPO." Naomi nodded. "That is the code word. He wants to cut you loose, but he wants to do it cheaply. He wants to rewrite the terms while you are still technically married, so he can force you into a corner." I looked out the window at the gray street. I thought about the girl from Michigan who believed in love. That girl was dead. In her place sat a woman who knew exactly how to read a contract. "Let him try," I said softly. Naomi looked at me, surprised by the tone of my voice. "Harper, this is going to be ugly. This is not just a divorce. This is a war." I picked up my coffee cup. "It is not a war. Naomi, in a war, both sides have weapons. Howard thinks I am unarmed." I realized then that this was no longer about jealousy. It was not about Lila Mercer's silver dress or Howard's Patek Philippe watch. This was a power struggle. He was trying to erase me from the narrative of his success, but he had forgotten one thing. History is written by the victors, but legal precedents are written by the people who read the footnotes. "I am ready." I told Naomi, "Let him bring the paperwork." I went back to the penthouse that afternoon and waited. I waited for the sound of the elevator. I waited for the heavy stack of papers. And I waited for my husband to make the mistake of thinking that just because he was the CEO, he was the smartest person in the room. The drive to the Hamptons was usually a time for us to decompress, to listen to jazz and watch the city fade into the rearview mirror. But that Friday in late October, the silence in the car was heavy enough to choke on. The Atlantic Ocean was gray and churning when we arrived at the house, a modern glass fortress perched on the dunes that Howard had bought 2 years ago. He called it a sanctuary. I called it a wind tunnel with heated floors. It was late afternoon when he asked me to walk with him down to the water. The wind was biting, whipping my hair across my face, but Howard didn't seem to notice. He was wearing a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my first car, and he walked with his hands deep in his pockets, staring at the horizon. "We need to have a serious conversation." "Harper," he said, not looking at me. My stomach tightened. I knew this tone. It was the tone he used when he was about to fire a senior executive or kill a product line. "Okay," I said, wrapping my coat tighter around myself. "What is it?" Howard stopped walking and turned to face me. The salt spray was misting on his glasses. "I am at a different level now," he said. "The company is scaling, the stakes are exponential, and frankly, the legal framework we set up 7 years ago is obsolete. It is a liability." He paused, waiting for me to nod, to agree with his assessment of his own importance. When I didn't, he continued, "I have been meeting with the strategic investors and the external counsel. They are all saying the same thing. I need to ring-fence my assets. The volatility of the market means I cannot have any exposure. The old prenup leaves too many doors open." I looked at him. Ring-fence? It was a term used for toxic assets or dangerous liabilities. "So, I have had a new agreement drafted," he said, his voice flat. "It minimizes any potential claim you might have on the estate. It establishes a clear firewall between my equity and our marital property." I felt a coldness spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the ocean wind. "Are you planning to divorce me?" "Howard," I asked. He sighed, looking annoyed that I had reduced his high-level strategy to something as messy as human emotion. "I am preparing for all possibilities." "Harper," he said, "successful people do not wait for an accident to happen before they buy insurance. This is risk management. That is all. Risk management, as if our marriage was a fluctuating currency exchange rate. And if I don't sign?" I asked. Howard looked at me with a frightening lack of empathy. His eyes were dead calm. "If you do not sign before the merger and acquisition deals close next month, I will have to take unilateral action to protect the fund. I will move all my primary assets into offshore trusts in the Cayman Islands and Singapore. I will transfer the intellectual property rights to a subsidiary you cannot touch." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "If you force my hand, Harper, I will structure my wealth so deeply that if we split, you will not be able to touch a single dollar. You will spend the rest of your life paying lawyers to chase ghosts." It was an ultimatum, plain and simple. Sign the paper and accept the crumbs, or fight and get nothing. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly despite my best efforts. "We are supposed to be a team." Howard laughed, a harsh barking sound that was snatched away by the wind. "A team you have been checking out for years. Harper, you are too emotionally independent. You never support me at the events that matter. You stand in the corner looking miserable while I am out there trying to sell a vision. That is not true." I protested. "I have been to every gala. I have hosted every dinner. You are physically there, but you are not present," he snapped. "You do not understand the pressure I'm under. That is why I have to talk to Lila. She gets it. She understands the burden of leadership. I have to confide in her because my wife is too busy analyzing everything to just be supportive." I stared at him. He was doing it again. He was rewriting reality. He was taking his infidelity, emotional or otherwise, and twisting it until it became my fault. He was making me the villain in a story where he was the one having late-night meetings on yachts. And let us be honest. "Harper," he said, his voice dripping with a sudden, cruel sweetness, "you should be grateful. I pulled you out of that tiny, rat-infested apartment in Detroit. I gave you a life you could never have dreamed of. I put you in penthouses and private jets. Do not act like this is a partnership of equals. This has always been a form of charity." The word hung in the air between us. Charity. He didn't see me as his wife. He saw me as a rescue dog that had started to bark too much. I looked at his face, the face I had once adored, and I saw the monster underneath. It wasn't a monster of rage. It was a monster of indifference. He didn't hate me. He just viewed me as an asset that had depreciated in value. I saw the pattern clearly. If I got upset, I was being sensitive. If I questioned his relationship with Lila, I was being jealous. If I asked about the finances, I was being greedy. But if he hid money, if he cheated, if he threatened me, it was just a business strategy. Something inside me hardened. The hurt didn't go away, but it crystallized into something sharp and useful. I took a deep breath, tasting the salt on my lips. If you want to treat me like a partner, Howard, then you need to remember something, I said, my voice steady. Partners have the right to negotiate. They do not sign contracts in the dark. Howard sneered. He looked at me with genuine pity. Negotiation is what poor people do with each other. Harper, he said, people with real power write the terms and tell others to sign. He checked his watch, dismissing me. The draft is on your desk in the city. I expect it will be signed by Monday. Do not make me unleash the lawyers on you. You will not win. He turned and walked back toward the house, leaving me standing alone on the beach. The wind howled around me, but I felt strangely calm. He thought he had won. He thought he had crushed me with his wealth and his cruelty. He thought that by telling me I was nothing, he had made me nothing. But he had made a critical error. He had forgotten who I was. He had forgotten that before I was the wife in the silk dress, I was the girl who read the fine print for a living. He had forgotten that I spent my days looking for the one missing comma that could crash a billion-dollar deal. I watched his figure disappear into the warmth of the glass house. Luckily for me, he had forgotten that I am someone who reads terms and edits every single comma. He wanted me to sign. I would sign. But I would not sign the document he thought he had written. I would sign the one I was about to rewrite. The fluorescent lights of Cinder Lake Legal Analytics hummed with a frequency that usually gave me a headache. On that Monday morning, I did not feel it. I sat in my cubicle, surrounded by associates who were frantically reviewing a merger between two pharmaceutical giants. They thought I was doing the same. They saw me holding a red pen, slashing through lines of text, my eyes scanning the dense paragraphs with the predatory focus of a hawk. They did not know that the document on my desk was not a billion-dollar corporate merger. It was the termination of my own life as I knew it. I had brought the draft of Howard's new prenuptial agreement to the office because it was the only place I could think clearly. At home. The marble walls and the silence felt like a prison. Here, among the smell of burnt coffee and the sound of furious typing, I was not a wife. I was an analyst. I turned the page. The terms were draconian. Howard's lawyers had drafted a clause that essentially stated that any asset not explicitly listed in a joint account which we did not have was considered his sole property. If I signed this version, I would leave the marriage with a fixed payout of $200,000. That was it. 7 years of supporting him, of managing his life, of being the invisible engine behind his success, was valued at the price of a used luxury car. I capped my pen and stood up. I needed a second opinion. Not a soft, sympathetic opinion, but a ruthless one. I met Naomi Rhodes an hour later at a coffee shop in a quiet corner of Brooklyn. It was a place with mismatched chairs and no Wi-Fi. The kind of place where people went to disappear. Naomi was already there, wearing a sharp blazer and looking at her watch. She was the best divorce attorney I knew, mostly because she did not believe in love. She believed in leverage. I slid the document across the scratched wooden table. She put on her reading glasses and started to read. I watched her face. For the first 5 minutes, she was impassive. Then, her eyebrows knit together. Finally, she let out a low, incredulous whistle. "Harper," she said, dropping the paper onto the table. "This is not a prenup. This is a robbery in progress." "I know," I said, sipping my black coffee. "If you sign this exactly as it is written," Naomi said, tapping the paper with a manicured fingernail, "you will get less than unemployment benefits. He has structured the exclusion clauses to cover everything: future earnings, equity grants, the house in the Hamptons, the jet. It is all ring-fenced. Legally, this is unconscionable. We could argue duress. But duress is hard to prove," I countered. "He will just say I had independent counsel and chose to sign. He has the best lawyers in the city. By the time we fight this in court, he will have hidden the assets in a dozen shell companies." Naomi sighed, leaning back in her chair. "You are right. If you fight him head on, you lose. He has more money, more time, and more spite. She looked at me, her eyes narrowing. So, what is the plan? You are not the type to just roll over. I leaned forward, lowering my voice. I'm not going to fight the prenup, Naomi. I am going to edit it. I reminded her of a case we had both studied in law school. A massive telecommunications deal that fell apart because of a single misplaced comma in a definition clause. A Canadian company lost $2 million because the contract said the agreement could be terminated at any time, without cause instead of at any time without cause, changing the entire meaning of the duration. Contracts are just code. I said to her, they are instructions. If you change the input, you change the output. Howard looks at the big numbers. He looks at the cap tables and the dollar signs. He never looks at the definitions. He thinks the schedules at the back are just housekeeping. Naomi smiled, a slow, dangerous smile. You want to trap him in the appendices? Exactly. I said, I want to create a circular reference, a nested loop. We spent the next 2 hours brainstorming. It felt less like legal consultation and more like planning a heist. We dissected the document like surgeons. We looked for the pivot point. The weakness was in how Howard's lawyers had defined net asset value. They had created a complex exclusion list in a section called Schedule C. Schedule C listed every company, every trust, and every patent Howard owned, declaring them off-limits. But there was another schedule, Schedule B. Schedule B was currently a placeholder for joint marital liabilities. It was empty. It was designed to list debts we shared. But since we had no shared debts, it was just a blank page. What if, I whispered, tapping the table, what if I redefine how the payout is calculated? What if, instead of a fixed number, I change the reference? If I could convince Howard that I was just cleaning up the language, making it simpler for the auditors, I could rewrite the definition of the payout. I could make the payout equal to a percentage of the total marital estate, and then, in the fine print of the definition section, the part that is usually 10 pages of boring text that no one reads, I could define total marital estate not by the exclusions in Schedule C, but by the inclusions in Schedule B. And then, I would just need to make sure Schedule B was not empty. Naomi looked at me, her eyes wide. You are going to invert the exclusion, she said. You are going to make the assets default to the joint pot unless he catches the reference switch. Yes, I said. And because he is arrogant, because he thinks I am just a paralegal playing house, he will not check the cross-reference. Naomi shook her head, looking half terrified and half impressed. Harper, you have to understand the risk. If he catches you, or if his lawyer takes one look at this, you are done. They will crush you. This is fraud, technically, or at least bad faith negotiation. I shook my head. It is not fraud. I am presenting a counteroffer. I am handing him a document. If he signs it without reading it, that is negligence on his part. He is the CEO of a billion-dollar company. He has a fiduciary duty to read what he signs. Naomi warned me again. You need to be sure he does not send this to his general counsel. I smiled. I know he won't. He told me specifically not to waste money on lawyers. He thinks he is smarter than everyone. I am counting on his ego. I left the coffee shop with a plan. I went back to the office, but I did not work on Cinder Lake business. I opened a fresh Word document. I scanned Howard's PDF into an editable format. I began to type. I did not change the big numbers. The payout cap of $200,000 remained on page 3, bold and clear. That was the decoy. That was the shiny object Howard would look for. I went to page 14, clause 14C. The original text read, "The wife shall be entitled to no portion of the husband's separate property as listed in Schedule C." I deleted it. I replaced it with a sentence that looked almost identical, using the same font, the same spacing, the same legal jargon. The wife's entitlement shall be calculated based on the adjusted net value of the estate, subject to the allocation protocols set forth in Schedule B, notwithstanding the exclusions in Schedule C. It sounded boring. It sounded like gibberish, but the key word was notwithstanding. In legal terms, notwithstanding is a trump card. It means that whatever follows overrules what came before. By saying subject to Schedule B, notwithstanding Schedule C, I was saying that Schedule B was the boss. Schedule C was now irrelevant. Now, I had to fix Schedule B. I scrolled to the end of the document. I found the blank page for Schedule B. I did not fill it with a list of companies. That would be too obvious. Instead, I inserted a single paragraph of text, formatted to look like a standard accounting procedure. For the purposes of Clause 14C, the allocation protocols shall include all incremental equity, vested or unvested, held by the husband in any entity formed during the marriage, valued at the time of the dissolution event. It was a masterstroke of burying the lid. I had hidden the diamond inside the plumbing. I printed the document. I used the same heavy bond paper that Howard's lawyers used. I bound it with the same blue cover, but I wasn't done. I needed insurance. I opened my personal email account. I found the thread from last week where Howard had written to me, "Harper, do not drag this out with attorneys. I have reviewed the terms myself. I do not want to waste $50,000 on legal fees for something so simple. Just sign it." I forwarded that email to my secure archive. I took a screenshot of his text message from yesterday. I trust my own judgment more than some billable hour leech. We do this internally. I was building a wall of evidence. If he ever tried to claim in court that he was misled, or that he didn't have legal representation, I would have his own words to prove that he had waived his right to counsel. He had chosen to be his own lawyer, and as the old saying goes, a man who represents himself has a fool for a client. I sat back in my chair and looked at the document. It looked so innocent. Just a stack of paper. But inside those pages, nestled between the definitions and the signature lines, was a bomb waiting to explode. The clock on the wall ticked toward 5 o'clock. I packed the document into my bag. My hands were steady. I was not Harper the victim anymore. I was Harper the architect. I thought about Howard's face when he told me negotiation was for poor people. I thought about Lila Mercer in her silver dress. I thought about the 7 years of being told I was lucky to be allowed in the room. I looked at the computer screen one last time, zooming in on the tiny reference to Schedule B. Sometimes, I thought to myself, revenge isn't about screaming or fighting. Sometimes, revenge is just copy-pasting the right words in the right place. I shut down my computer, picked up my bag, and walked out of the office. I was going home to sign my life away. Or rather, I was going home to sign his life away. The room was so quiet, I could hear the carbonation fizzing in the water glass on my desk. It was 5 minutes past midnight. The new day had officially begun, and with it, a new fiscal reality for the West household. Howard leaned back in my ergonomic chair, the leather creaking under his weight. He pressed the intercom button on the desk phone, his finger lingering on it with the heavy, uncoordinated touch of a man who had consumed too much scotch. "Bring up the vintage Cabernet." He barked into the speaker, the 1996, and 2 glasses. He looked at me, his eyes glassy but triumphant. "We should celebrate." "Harper," he said, gesturing vaguely at the air. "It is not every day you secure the future of a legacy." He made it sound like a romantic ritual. He was turning the act of stripping me of my marital rights into a toast. It was grotesque, but I forced the corners of my mouth upward into a soft, compliant smile. I slid the document across the glass surface of the desk toward him. My hands were steady, though my pulse was hammering against my wrist bone like a trapped bird. This was the version I had printed at the office. This was the version with the inverted definitions and the loaded Schedule B. I just organized the flow. I said, keeping my voice even, "It reads much cleaner now. The auditors will appreciate the clarity." Howard grunted, pulling the heavy stack of paper toward him. He did not read the first page. He did not read the definitions section where I had buried the landmine. He flipped straight to page 5, the section detailing the lump sum payment in the event of a divorce. He ran his finger down the page until he found the number, $200,000. He smiled. It was a cruel, satisfied smile. "See," he said, tapping the paper. "That is fair. It is enough to get you set up in a nice apartment somewhere, maybe back in Michigan. He flipped a few more pages, scanning rapidly, his eyes skipping over the dense blocks of text. He was not reading for comprehension. He was reading for confirmation. He wanted to see the shapes of the clauses he recognized, the structures that made him feel safe. Then, he stopped. He was looking at a clause on page 12. It was a section regarding future equity distributions. In my revision, I had left a standard placeholder percentage of 2% of incremental equity, a common token amount for spouses in high-value prenups, just to make the document look standard. Howard frowned. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his Mont Blanc fountain pen. The black resin gleamed under the desk lamp. 2% is too high, he muttered, shaking his head. The board will never go for that. It exposes the voting stock. He looked up at me, his expression hardening. I told you not to touch the numbers. Harper, I did not touch them. I lied smoothly. That was in the original draft your lawyer sent over. It is a standard boilerplate, he scoffed. My lawyers are idiots. 2% of a post-IPO valuation could be hundreds of millions. We need to cap this. He uncapped the pen. The sound was a sharp click that echoed in the room. I am changing this, he announced, his voice slurring slightly. We are moving this into the West Dynasty Trust bucket, and we are dropping the percentage. My heart stopped. This was not part of the plan. If he deleted the clause entirely, or if he rewrote it correctly, my trap in Schedule B might not trigger. I watched his hand hover over the paper. I placed my phone on the edge of the desk, face down. The voice recording app was running. More importantly, on the other end of the open line, Naomi Rhodes was listening in silence, a witness to the fact that Howard was making these changes voluntarily, without duress, and with full mental capacity. Howard crossed out the printed text with a violent slash of black ink. I am making this 0.2%, he mumbled, writing in the margin. And it goes to the trust. Not you directly. You only get the yield. He began to write. I watched the nib of the pen scratch against the paper. I held my breath. He wrote the words 0.2% of any incremental equity to be transferred to West Dynasty Trust. But then, he went to write the numerical figure in parentheses, a standard legal practice to ensure clarity. He was tired. He was arrogant. He was thinking about the wine that was on its way up, and he was used to writing big numbers, not small ones, in the parentheses, instead of writing 0.2%. His hand moved in a fluid, practiced loop. He wrote 2.0%. He wrote 2.0%. He missed the decimal place. He missed the zero in front. In his exhaustion and hubris, he wrote a number that was 10 times higher than what he had written in words. But that was not the only mistake. By manually writing incremental equity in his own handwriting, he had just tied this specific clause to the definition I had altered earlier, in the document I had prepared. Incremental equity was defined in the glossary as the total unvested stock options the founder, regardless of trust structures. And because he had written 2.0% in the numbers column, I knew exactly what Naomi would argue in court. She would argue that the handwritten number was the true intent, the specific figure he had in mind. While the words were just a slip of the tongue, she would argue that he meant 2% all along, because that was the number he physically drew. But even if they argued it down to 0.2%, it did not matter. 0.2% of the total unvested empire, which I had successfully redefined in the hidden Schedule B, was still a fortune. It was not 0.2% of a small trust. It was 0.2% of everything. He had just handed me a key to the vault, and he thought he was locking the door. There, Howard said, looking at his handiwork. That is better, tighter. He blew on the ink to dry it. He did not double-check the number. He did not look at the decimal. He just saw what he wanted to see, a restriction. He flipped to the last page. He signed his name aggressively, the signature large and looping, taking up 2 lines. Howard West, he said, capping the pen. He pushed the document toward me. Your turn. Harper. I reached for the pen. My hand was trembling. Just a fraction. I told myself to breathe. I told myself to think of the silver dress Lila Mercer wore. I told myself to think of the years of invisibility. I took the pen. The barrel was warm from his hand. I looked at the signature page. I looked at the date. It was technically the next day. I signed my name, Harper Jackson. The ink flowed smoothly, dark and permanent. I watched the letters form. With each loop of the H and the J, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. I was not just signing a contract, I was signing a death warrant for his control over me. Done, I whispered. Just then, the elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. The assistant walked in, carrying a silver tray with the bottle of 1996 Cabernet and 2 crystal glasses. Perfect timing, Howard said, clapping his hands together. He stood up, swaying slightly, and walked over to the tray. He poured the wine himself, the dark red liquid swirling into the glasses. He handed one to me. To us, he said, raising his glass, or rather, to the next 7 years. May they be as profitable as the last. I raised my glass. The crystal felt heavy in my hand. To be accurate, I said softly. Howard laughed, missing the edge in my voice completely. To be accurate, he agreed, and to know your place. He drained half the glass in one swallow. I took a small sip. It tasted like iron and blackberries. It tasted like victory. We sat there for another 20 minutes. Howard rambled on about the IPO, about how the market was going to explode when they announced the new algorithm. He talked about how he was going to buy an island in the Caribbean. He talked about Lila, slipping up once and calling her before correcting himself to the team. I just nodded. I listened, and I watched the clock. Finally, the alcohol and the exhaustion caught up with him. He yawned, a jaw-cracking sound. I am beat, he said, standing up unsteadily. Put the papers in the safe. Harper, we will have the lawyers file them in the morning. He stumbled toward the bedroom, not even looking back to say goodnight. I waited. I waited until I heard the heavy thud of the bedroom door closing. I waited another 10 minutes, until the silence of the penthouse was absolute. Then, I moved. I did not put the papers in the safe, not yet. I took the document over to the scanner on the credenza. I set the resolution to the highest setting. I scanned every single page, paying special attention to page 12, where his handwritten 2.0% sat next to his initials. The light of the scanner bar moved back and forth, a hypnotic rhythm. Whir, click, whir, click. I saved the file as a PDF. I encrypted it with a 20-character password. I emailed it to my secure account. Then, I uploaded it to 3 different cloud storage services, one hidden in a folder of recipes, one in a folder of old tax returns, and one on a server Naomi had set up for me. I sent a text to Naomi. It is done. Page 12, handwritten. He wrote 2.0. Her reply came back instantly. I heard, you are a cold woman. Harper. I love it. I took the physical document. I walked over to the wall safe hidden behind the painting of the abstract storm. I keyed in the code. The heavy steel door swung open. I placed the document inside, right next to his passport and his stash of emergency cash. I closed the safe. I spun the dial. I walked back to the desk and picked up my wine glass. I walked to the window and looked out at the city. The lights of Manhattan were burning below me. Millions of people living their lives, oblivious to the silent coup that had just happened in the sky. Howard was asleep in the next room, dreaming of billions. He thought he had just secured his empire. He thought he had outsmarted the girl from Michigan. He had miscalculated, not because he was stupid. Howard was a genius in his own narrow way. He miscalculated because he believed that I was incapable of playing the game. He believed that I loved him too much, or feared him too much, to ever make a move. He forgot the most basic rule of mechanics for every action. There is an equal and opposite reaction. He had pushed me for 7 years. Tonight, I had finally pushed back. I finished the wine and set the glass down on the coaster. Sleep tight. Howard, I whispered, the meter is running. The Hotel Astrium rooftop in Manhattan is designed to make you feel like you are floating above the world, detached from the grime and gravity of ordinary life. It is a place where the cocktails cost $30, and the view of the Empire State Building is so close, you feel like you could reach out and scratch the glass. 1 month has passed since I signed the new prenuptial agreement. 1 month since Howard believed he had successfully demoted me from partner to passenger. Tonight was the gala to celebrate the closing of the merger, the deal that was supposed to propel Neon Harbor Labs into the stratosphere. I stood near the edge of the terrace, holding a flute of champagne that I had no intention of drinking. The wind was biting, whipping the hem of my velvet gown around my ankles, but I barely felt it. I was too busy watching my husband. Howard was in his element. He was standing in the center of a circle of investors, laughing at a joke that probably was not funny. He looked golden, radiant with success, and standing right next to him, close enough that their arms brushed every time he moved, was Lila Mercer. Since the night I signed the papers, Howard had stopped pretending. He no longer tried to hide the late nights or the weekend strategy sessions. He posted photos of them together on his social media feeds, captioned with words like synergy and vision. He paraded her around the city like a trophy that also happened to have an MBA, and I was the ghost. I moved through the crowd, forcing a smile onto my face. I could feel the eyes of the guests on me. These were people I had known for 7 years, the wives of board members, the venture capitalists, the tech journalists. They looked at me, and then they looked away. I saw the pity in their glances. I heard the hushed whispers that died down as soon as I approached. Poor Harper. They were thinking, she is the last one to know. They did not know that I was the only one who actually knew the score. I watched a well-known tech blogger corner Howard and Lila near the ice sculpture. The blogger was live streaming. I saw the red light of the camera recording. Howard put his hand on the small of Lila's back. It was a proprietary gesture, comfortable and intimate. Lila leaned into him, whispering something in his ear that made him throw his head back and laugh. I stood 10 feet away, effectively invisible. To them, I was just part of the scenery, like the potted palms or the heat lamps. I was the wife who had been managed, the liability that had been capped. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, the voice of the master of ceremonies boomed over the speakers. The jazz band stopped playing. The murmur of the crowd faded into silence. Howard stepped up to the microphone on the small stage. The spotlight hit him, turning his tuxedo into a silhouette against the city skyline. He looked commanding. He looked like a man who owned the world. "Thank you all for coming," Howard said, his voice amplified and rich. "Tonight is about the future. It is about the next chapter of Neon Harbor. But no man builds an empire alone." He paused for dramatic effect. My heart gave a single, painful thud against my ribs. For a split second, a foolish, naive part of me thought he might mention the beginning, the nights in the cramped apartment where I proofread his code documentation because he was too tired to see straight, the times I used my own savings to pay the server bills when investors said no. "I want to invite someone up here," Howard continued, his eyes scanning the front row. "Someone who has been the architect of this new era, someone who understands me, who challenges me, and who has been my true partner in every difficult decision over the last year." He extended his hand. "Lila, please come up here." The applause was polite, but there was a ripple of tension in the air. Everyone knew I was there. Everyone knew this was a breach of social protocol, a public erasure of the wife standing in the shadows. Lila walked up the steps. She looked stunning in a dress that was cut aggressively low, a shimmering column of obsidian silk. She took Howard's hand. He pulled her close, not into a professional handshake, but into a half embrace. "This woman," Howard said, looking at her with an intensity he had not shown me in years, "is the reason we are all standing here tonight. She is the brain, the spine, and the heart of this deal. To the most talented executive I have ever known. To my partner," he raised his glass. To Lila, the crowd echoed, the sound a little ragged, a little uncertain. Howard clinked his glass against hers. Then, right there in front of 300 guests and a dozen live-streaming phones, Lila leaned in and kissed him on the cheek. It lingered a second too long. Her lips were dangerously close to the corner of his mouth. It was a claim. It was a territorial mark. The crowd cheered, because that is what crowds do when billionaires tell them to. But I saw the glances darting in my direction. They were waiting for me to crack. They were waiting for the scene, the tears, the running mascara. I did not give it to them. I stood perfectly still. My knuckles were white where I gripped the stem of my glass. The glass was fragile. I could have crushed it with a fraction more pressure. I imagined the shards biting into my palm, the physical pain distracting me from the hollow ache in my chest. But I didn't. I took a sip of the champagne. It tasted like acid. I set the glass down on a passing tray and turned on my heel. I walked with a steady, measured pace toward the interior of the hotel. I did not run. I did not look down. I kept my head high, my expression pleasantly blank, as if I were simply going to powder my nose. I pushed open the heavy door to the ladies' restroom. It was an oasis of marble and silence. The thumping bass of the party was muffled here. I walked to the sink and gripped the cold porcelain. I looked at myself in the mirror. My skin was pale, but my eyes were dry. I am not going to cry. I whispered to my reflection. Crying is for people who have no other options. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. I did not call my mother. I did not call a therapist. I opened my secure evidence app. I created a new entry. Date November 14th, time 9:45 post-meridian, location Hotel Astrium Rooftop, incident, public humiliation and open alienation of affection. Subject Howard West publicly declared Lila Mercer his true partner, unquote, and quoted heart of the deal in front of investors and media. Physical intimacy observed and recorded. I switched apps and found the live stream link from the tech blogger. I copied the URL. I took screenshots of the comments section, where people were already speculating. Is that his wife? No. That is the COO. They look like a couple. I noted the names of 3 reporters I saw recording the speech. These would be my witnesses. When I eventually filed for divorce, I would not just claim emotional distress. I would prove public reputational damage. I would prove that he had actively worked to diminish my role in the marital partnership to elevate his mistress. I typed furiously, my thumbs flying across the screen. I was logging the trauma. I was turning my pain into data. When a man treats you like an accessory, you do not break. You become a surveillance state. I saved the entry and uploaded it to the cloud. I put the phone back in my clutch. I checked my lipstick. It was a deep, blood-red shade. It was perfect. I looked into the camera of my mind, speaking to anyone who has ever been made to feel small by a man who grew too big. I promised myself one thing. If he dares to turn me into a decoration in his story in front of the entire world, I will turn his signature into a confession in front of a judge. I straightened my shoulders. I smoothed the velvet of my dress. I walked back out onto the rooftop. The speech was over. The band was playing upbeat jazz again. Howard and Lila were holding court near the bar. Surrounded by sycophants, they looked like the king and queen of the prom. I walked straight toward them. The crowd parted for me, silence rippling outward like a wave. People held their breath. They expected a confrontation. They expected a drink thrown in their faces. Howard saw me coming. His smile faltered for a microsecond, then returned, tight and defensive. Lila straightened her spine, her eyes narrowing, preparing for a catfight. I stopped in front of them. I did not look at Howard. I looked directly at Lila. I extended my hand. Lila stared at it for a moment, confused. Then, realizing she had an audience, she reached out and took it. Her hand was cold and clammy. I smiled. It was the warmest, most terrifying smile I had ever produced. That was a beautiful speech, I said, my voice clear enough for the circle of people around us to hear. Lila blinked. Thank you. Harper. I held her hand for a second longer than was comfortable. I squeezed it, just enough to let her feel the strength in my fingers. I just wanted to thank you. Lila, I said, for what she asked, her guard dropping slightly, for making him believe that paperwork is more important than people. I said sweetly. I let go of her hand and turned my gaze to Howard. He looked confused, trying to parse if I was complimenting him or insulting him. "It is the language I speak best," I added. I nodded to them both, turned, and walked away. I could feel Howard's eyes boring into my back. He was probably wondering what I meant. He was probably telling himself I was just being weird, that I was broken and trying to save face. He had no idea. He thought I was thanking her for the company's success, but I was thanking her for the distraction. I was thanking her for keeping his ego so inflated that he never looked down at the ground to see the trapdoor I had built beneath his feet. I walked to the elevator, pressed the button, and descended 40 floors back to the street. I hailed a cab. "Take me to Brooklyn." I told the driver I needed to see Naomi. We had a new piece of evidence to add to the file, and for the first time in 7 years, I didn't feel like the wife waiting in the wings. I felt like the director of the show. 2 o'clock in the morning is a dangerous time. It is the hour when impulsive text messages are sent, when regrets keep you staring at the ceiling, and when empires are quietly dismantled from a kitchen island. I sat alone in the dark, the blue light of my laptop illuminating my face. The gala was over. Howard was asleep in the master bedroom, likely dreaming of the applause he had received. He had no idea that while he was sleeping, his carefully constructed world was about to collide with an iceberg. I had 3 email drafts open on my screen. The first was addressed to the head of the ethics committee at Neon Harbor Labs. The second was for the chairman of the board. The third was for the external general counsel who handled the company's liability insurance. I was not writing these emails as a scorned wife. A scorned wife writes about betrayal and heartbreak. I was writing as a concerned stakeholder reporting a massive governance risk. I did not use the word affair. I used the phrase conflict of interest. I did not talk about love. I talked about misappropriation of corporate assets. Attached to each email was a compressed file I had named the Lila Collection. It was a masterpiece of forensic accounting. It contained side-by-side comparisons of Howard's flight logs and Lila's travel itinerary. It showed the receipts for the resort in Aspen, charged to the company marketing budget, for a weekend where no other staff were present. It included the time-stamped screenshots of their intimate comments on the internal company messaging system, Slack, which Howard thought was private, but was actually archived on a server I had access to. It included the $4,000 invoices for private dinners classified as client development, where the only client was his chief operating officer. I read the cover letter one last time. It was dry, professional, and devastating. To the board of directors. Please find attached evidence suggesting a pattern of conduct by the chief executive officer and chief operating officer that exposes the company to significant liability, including potential sexual harassment suits, misuse of shareholder funds, and breaches of the code of conduct regarding executive fraternization. I took a sip of water. My finger hovered over the enter key. If you are listening to this and you think documentation is boring, you are wrong. Documentation is the only magic spell that works in the real world. If you write it down, it happened. If you save the receipt, you own the truth. I pressed send. I watched the progress bar load. Sent. I closed the laptop. The first domino had been pushed. Now, I just had to wait for gravity to do the rest. The next morning, I did not stay home to watch the fallout. I had a meeting that was even more important. I met Naomi and a man named Arthur Blake in a conference room in Midtown. Arthur was a legend in the field of matrimonial law. He was the kind of man who wore 3-piece suits and looked at a prenup the way a butcher looks at a carcass. He charged $1,000 an hour, and he was worth every penny. I slid the signed copy of the new prenuptial agreement across the mahogany table. This was the copy I had retrieved from the safe, the one with Howard's ink still fresh on the last page. Arthur put on his spectacles. He did not read the whole thing. I directed him immediately to page 12. He stared at the clause. He stared at the handwritten note in the margin. He stared at the initials Howard had scrawled next to it. For a long minute, the room was silent. Then, Arthur made a sound I did not expect. He chuckled. It was a dry, dusty sound. He really wrote 2.0%, Arthur said, looking up at me over his glasses. He wrote the number 2, a decimal point, And a zero. Yes, I said. He meant to write 0.2%. He said it out loud, but he was tired, and he had been drinking, and he wrote what he wrote. Arthur tapped the page. And this reference here, he said, flipping back to the definitions. You changed the pointer for incremental equity to Schedule B. I nodded. And Schedule B includes all unvested stock, Arthur said, his eyes widening slightly. Not just the trust assets, everything. He sat back in his chair and took off his glasses. He looked at Naomi, then at me. Mrs. West, do you understand what you have done? Arthur asked. I think so, I said, but I want you to tell me. Arthur leaned forward. By writing 2.0% by hand, your husband overrode the printed text. In contract law, handwritten amendments usually take precedence over boilerplate because they indicate specific intent. He cannot argue it was a typo because he initiated it, and because you redirected the definition to Schedule B. He did not just give you 2% of a small, ring-fenced trust. He gave you 2% of his entire personal holding in Neon Harbor Labs. He did the math in his head. At the current valuation of the company, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a whisper, that 2% is worth roughly $350 million. The number hung in the air. $350 million. But it is not just the money, Arthur continued. That amount of stock comes with voting rights. If you exercise this clause, you will become one of the largest individual shareholders in the company. You will not just be his ex-wife, you will be his boss. I felt a shiver run down my spine. This was better than I had imagined. I had aimed for financial security. I had accidentally secured a seat at the table. Naomi spoke up, her voice sharp and strategic. We cannot file for divorce yet, she said. Why not? I asked. Because right now, Howard is still the golden boy, Naomi explained. If we file today, he will throw the entire weight of his legal team at this document. He will claim fraud. He will claim you tricked him with the Schedule B switch. It will be a messy fight. She leaned in closer. But you just sent those emails last night, right? I nodded. Then we wait. Naomi said, we let the board of directors receive the complaint. We let the ethics committee launch their investigation. We let the scandal break. When the board sees the evidence of him using company money to romance his COO, they are going to panic. They will force him to step down, or at least suspend him to protect the stock price. She smiled, a wolfish grin. A man fighting for his job is distracted, Naomi said. A man who has lost his reputation is weak. We wait until the board turns on him. We wait until he is drowning in the scandal. And then, when he is at his lowest point, when his lawyers are busy trying to keep him out of jail for embezzlement, that is when we drop the divorce papers. He will not have the bandwidth to fight the prenup. He will be too busy trying to save his career. It was brutal. It was cold. And it was perfect. I looked at Arthur. Does that work for you? Arthur nodded. It is the domino theory. You knock down the first one, his reputation. The second one, his career falls next. And the third one, his fortune falls right into your lap. I left the meeting feeling lighter than I had in years. I walked out onto the busy streets of New York. I looked up at the skyscrapers, wondering how many other men were sitting in corner offices, thinking they were invincible, unaware that a single sheet of paper could bring them down. To everyone listening, if you believe that revenge is a dish best served cold, you are only half right. Revenge is a dish best served with proper legal counsel and a timing strategy. I went back to the penthouse and waited. I did not have to wait long. 3 days later, I was sitting in the living room reading a book when Howard's phone rang. He was in the kitchen, making an espresso. I heard him answer. West here, he said, his voice confident. Then, silence. A long, heavy silence. What do you mean? An inquiry. Howard's voice pitched up an octave. That is absurd. Who sent it? He listened for another moment. Then he slammed his hand down on the marble counter. The sound echoed through the apartment like a gunshot. I cannot come in right now. Howard started, then stopped. Fine, I will be there in an hour. He walked into the living room. His face was pale. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a flicker of genuine fear. I have to go to the office, he said, not looking at me. Emergency board meeting. Is everything okay? I asked, feigning innocence. It is just some bureaucratic nonsense, he muttered, grabbing his jacket. Someone is trying to stir up trouble. I will handle it. He left without kissing me goodbye. 10 minutes after he left, my own phone rang. It was an unknown number. I answered. Hello, Mrs. West, a woman's voice asked. It was professional, firm, but polite. Speaking, I said, This is Patricia Vance. I am the chair of the ethics committee at Neon Harbor Labs. I felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. The machine was turning. Hello, Patricia, I said calmly. Mrs. West, I am calling because we received a substantial file of information regarding your husband and Ms. Mercer. Patricia said, Given the sensitive nature of the documents, and the fact that some of the travel logs involve you, or rather, your absence, we would like to speak with you. We are treating this as a whistleblower situation. She paused. The board is extremely concerned. Mrs. West, if these documents are authentic, Howard's position as CEO is in serious jeopardy. Can you confirm if you have access to the original copies of these receipts? I looked at the phone. I looked at the empty apartment. Yes. Patricia, I said, I have the originals. I have everything. When would you like to meet? I hung up the phone and stood up. I walked to the window and looked out at the skyline. Somewhere in that concrete jungle, Howard was walking into a room full of people who were about to ask him very difficult questions. He thought he was the king. He didn't realize he was already a checkmate. This story started with a contract signed at midnight, but it was going to end in a boardroom in the middle of the day. I went to my closet and picked out a suit. Not a dress. A suit. Today, I wasn't dressing like a wife. I was dressing like a witness for the prosecution. The boardroom at Neon Harbor Labs was known as the Aquarium because 3 of its 4 walls were made of soundproof glass. Usually, this design was meant to symbolize transparency. Today, however, it merely provided a terrified audience of junior employees a front-row seat to the execution of their CEO. I was not inside the room, but I did not need to be. Naomi had a contact in the legal department, a paralegal named Sarah who owed her a favor. Sarah was texting us updates every 10 minutes. Howard sat at the head of the long mahogany table. Across from him sat the board of directors, their faces grim. On the large projection screen behind him, where he usually displayed growth charts and revenue projections, was the Lila collection. The photos were damning. There was the receipt for the private villa in St. Bart's, paid for with the corporate credit card under the code for client acquisition. There was the flight manifest for the company jet, listing only 2 passengers, Howard West and Lila Mercer. There were the transcripts of the messages they had exchanged on the internal server, messages that shifted from professional strategy to intimate planning without a pause. According to Sarah, Howard tried to laugh it off. He leaned back in his chair, flashing the smile that had charmed investors for a decade. This is ridiculous, he told them. These are malicious rumors started by competitors. Lila and I are close colleagues. We work late. We travel together. That is the job. The chairman of the board, a man named Elias Thorne, who had no sense of humor and even less patience for liability, did not smile back. We have confirmed the metadata on the receipts. Howard, Elias said, and we have statements from the flight crew. This is not a rumor. This is a governance nightmare. Meanwhile, Lila was being held in a separate conference room down the hall. It was a classic prisoner's dilemma. The general counsel was interviewing her separately, asking her to verify the timeline of the trips. The word around the office was that the board had already made a decision. To save the stock price, one of them had to go. And since Howard was the face of the brand, they were leaning toward keeping him and sacrificing her, provided he agreed to a probationary period and a public apology. But the board was also pragmatic. They were preparing a golden parachute for Howard, just in case. A resignation package that would allow him to leave with his dignity intact, citing personal reasons, as long as he signed a non-compete agreement that would keep him out of the industry for 5 years. It was in the middle of this tense negotiation that the courier arrived. He walked right up to the glass door of the boardroom. He did not care about the tension. He had a job to do. He knocked twice. A junior lawyer opened the door. The courier handed him a thick manila envelope addressed to Howard West. Howard took the envelope. He frowned. He opened it. Inside was a petition for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences in adultery. And clipped to the back was a copy of the post-nuptial agreement we had signed 1 month ago. Howard looked at the papers. He did not look devastated. He looked relieved. He actually chuckled. He looked up at his personal lawyer, Gerald Knox, a man who charged $1,200 an hour to wear pinstripes and look confident. She finally did it. Howard said, tossing the papers onto the table. My wife. She is filing for divorce. Gerald Knox picked up the document. This might be good for us. Howard, he said, we can spin this. We can say the stress of the failing marriage caused the lapse in judgment with Lila. It humanizes you. Sympathy points. Howard nodded, his arrogance returning. And the best part is, she cannot touch the money. We signed a new prenup last month. I locked it all down. She walks away with a flat fee. He tapped the document with his finger. We have her completely surrounded. Howard said. Gerald Knox opened the prenup. He started to read, nodding along with the standard clauses. He was scanning fast, looking for the exit terms. Then, he stopped. He was on page 14. He squinted. He brought the paper closer to his face. He adjusted his glasses. Howard, Gerald said, his voice losing its confident baritone. Did you review the final draft of this before you signed it? Of course, Howard said, dismissive. I wrote the final edits myself. I made it tighter. Gerald looked at the associate standing next to him. Check the definition section, he ordered. Look at the reference for Schedule B. The associate flipped to the back of the document. He read the text. I had inserted the text that redefined the marital estate to include all unvested equity. His face went pale. Mr. Knox, the associate whispered. Schedule B includes the entire incremental equity pool. Gerald turned back to page 14. He pointed a shaking finger at the handwritten note in the margin. Howard, Gerald asked slowly. Why is there a decimal point here? What Howard asked, annoyed. You wrote 2.0%, Gerald said. You wrote the number 2, then a dot, then a 0. So Howard shrugged. It is 2%, or 0.2. Whatever. It is a tiny fraction. Gerald looked at him with the horror of a man watching a train wreck in slow motion. No, Howard. In contract law, when there is a discrepancy between the words and the numbers, especially when the number is handwritten and initiated by the signatory, the handwritten intent carries massive weight. You wrote 2.0. That is 2%. 2% is nothing, Howard snapped. 2% of a trust is peanuts. It is not 2% of the trust, Gerald said, his voice rising. Because of the Schedule B reference you approved, it is 2% of your entire holding in Neon Harbor Labs. The room went dead silent. Howard blinked. He looked around the table. The board members were staring at him. Someone did the mental math. The current market capitalization of Neon Harbor was hovering in the billions. 2% of Howard's personal stake was not just money, it was a voting power. That is hundreds of millions of dollars, the associate whispered. And worse, Gerald added, looking like he might be sick. With that amount of stock, she is not just a creditor, she is a major shareholder. If she combines her voting bloc with the minority stakeholders who are already angry about this scandal, she could force a hostile takeover. She could vote you out. Howard stood up. His chair scraped violently against the floor. That is a typo, he shouted. It is a clerical error. I meant 0.2. Anyone can see that. He grabbed his phone. I will call her, Howard said, his hands shaking. I will tell her to fix it. She knows what I meant. She is just a paralegal. She made a formatting mistake. Gerald Knox shook his head. Do not call her Howard. If you call her, you admit you read it. She tricked me. Howard yelled. She got me drunk. She confused me with the paperwork. Just then, Gerald's phone buzzed. It was an email from Naomi Rhodes. Subject: evidence of competence. Gerald opened the email. Attached was the video file from the security camera in our penthouse office. It showed Howard sitting at the desk, drinking wine, laughing. It showed him picking up the pen. It showed him writing the numbers. It showed him signing his name with a flourish. And below the video was a screenshot of the email Howard had sent me weeks ago. I do not want to waste money on lawyers. I will review the terms myself. I know what I'm doing. Gerald looked at the phone, then at Howard. We cannot argue you were tricked. Howard, Gerald said quietly, we cannot argue you were coerced. You are on video. You are the CEO. You explicitly waived legal counsel in writing. You wrote the number yourself. Howard sank back into his chair. The fight drained out of him. He looked small. An hour later, I sat in a private negotiation room on the 45th floor. The view was spectacular, but I was focused on the man sitting across from me. Howard looked like he had aged 10 years in 10 hours. His tie was loosened. His eyes were red. He looked at me with a mixture of hatred and confusion. Gerald Knox sat beside him, silent. Naomi sat beside me, looking like a shark that had just smelled blood in the water. You planned this, Howard said, his voice raspy. You planned this whole thing. I did not answer. I just folded my hands on the table. You took advantage of me, Howard spat out. I was tired. I had been drinking. You knew I would not read the fine print. You betrayed me. I looked him in the eye. I did not blink. I did not betray you. Howard, I said calmly, I facilitated you. What he asked. You told me for 7 years that negotiation is for poor people. I said, you told me that powerful people write the terms and everyone else just signs. You told me that you were smarter than the lawyers. You told me that I was just a detail in your life. I leaned forward. I simply let you be right. Howard, I let you be the powerful man who writes his own terms. I let you be the genius who does not need advice. I presented a document. You chose to edit it. You chose to sign it. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. I did not force your hand. I continued. I did not hold a gun to your head. I just handed you a pen and let your ego do the rest. Howard looked down at the table. You are going to take everything, aren't you? He whispered. No, I said. I am taking exactly what you signed away. 2%. I stood up. But Howard, I added, pausing at the door, you should know that the board has reached out to me. They are very concerned about the stability of the company given your personal indiscretions. They value stability. And as one of the newest major shareholders, I have a lot of thoughts about stability. Howard looked up. There was fear in his eyes now. Real fear. He realized that I wasn't just taking the money, I was taking his legacy. You are a monster, he whispered. I smiled. It was the same smile I had given him the night he told me to sign the original prenup 7 years ago. The smile of a girl who was willing to do whatever it took to survive. No, Howard, I said, I am just the wife who learned how to read. I walked out of the room, leaving him alone with his lawyers and his regrets. The hallway was quiet. Naomi walked beside me. He is going to settle, Naomi said. He has to. If this goes to court, he loses the company entirely. I know. I said. We walked to the elevator. I pressed the button. For 7 years, I had been the woman waiting for permission. Permission to speak. Permission to spend. Permission to exist. Now, the only permission I needed was my own signature. The elevator doors opened. I stepped inside. I checked my phone. There was a new email from Patricia Vance, the ethics chair, Mrs. West. The board would like to formalize your role as an advisor during this transition period. We believe your insight into the structural risks of the current leadership would be invaluable. I typed a quick reply. I would be happy to help. I hit send. The doors closed, and I began my ascent. The courtroom in the New York Family Court building was quiet, a stark contrast to the media circus camping on the sidewalk 40 floors below. The downfall of Howard West had been the headline of the month. Neon Harbor Labs had issued a press release 2 weeks ago stating that Howard was stepping down as CEO due to personal reasons to focus on his family. It was the polite corporate euphemism for being forced out by a board of directors terrified of a governance scandal. Lila Mercer had resigned quietly the same day, disappearing into the Hamptons with a non-disclosure agreement and a tarnished reputation. Inside the courtroom, there were no cameras. There was only the low hum of the ventilation system and the rustling of expensive paper. Howard sat at the plaintiff's table. He looked diminished. The bespoke suit still fit, but he wore it like a costume. His skin was sallow, and his hands, resting on the oak table, would not stop fidgeting. His lawyer, Gerald Knox, looked equally weary. They knew the math, they knew the odds, but they had to fight because the alternative was total capitulation. Gerald stood up to present their closing argument. He tried to paint Howard as a victim of sophisticated entrapment, Your Honor, he began, his voice projecting forced confidence. We are not disputing that Mr. West signed the document. We are disputing the integrity of the process. My client was under extreme emotional distress. He was exhausted. Furthermore, the respondent, Ms. Jackson, used her professional expertise as a contract analyst to obfuscate the terms. She hid a material change in a schedule reference that a layperson would not notice. We move that Clause 14C be declared void for unconscionability, or that the entire post-nuptial agreement be set aside due to fraudulent inducement. It was a desperate argument. They were claiming that the billionaire genius who built a tech empire was too simple-minded to understand a cross-reference. Naomi Rhodes stood up for our side. She did not use flowery language. She used evidence. She walked the judge through the timeline. She presented the emails. She played the audio recording I had taken of Howard, yelling that negotiation was for poor people. She showed the security footage from the penthouse office. The video played on the monitors in the courtroom. It showed Howard pouring wine. It showed him laughing. It showed him dismissing me when I tried to speak. And most damning of all, it showed him picking up his Mont Blanc pen and aggressively crossing out the printed text to write his own terms. Your Honor, Naomi said, pausing the video on the frame where Howard was writing. Mr. West explicitly waived his right to counsel in writing. He stated, in his own words, that he knew what he was doing. He did not just sign this document. He edited it. He took a red pen to the draft and inserted his own figures. Naomi turned to look at Howard. He wrote the number 2.0%. She continued. He wrote it by hand. He initiated it. This was not a trap set by my client. This was an act of supreme arrogance by a man who believed he was above the details. Then, it was my turn to testify. I walked to the stand. I swore to tell the truth. I sat down and looked at Howard. He refused to meet my eyes. Mrs. West, the judge asked, looking at me over her spectacles. She was a woman in her 50s with a sharp, no-nonsense face. Why did you structure the document this way? Why hide the definition in Schedule B? I took a breath. I spoke clearly, my voice steady, because, Your Honor, I was given an ultimatum. My husband told me that if I did not sign a new agreement that stripped me of my rights, he would hide his assets in offshore trusts where I could never reach them. He told me I was a liability. He told me I was nothing without him. I gripped the railing of the witness stand. I could not fight him with money. I said, I could not fight him with power. So I fought him with the only thing he used to control me. I used the contract. I gave him exactly what he asked for. He wanted to rewrite the terms. I let him. I did not force him to write the wrong number. I simply let him believe he was too smart to make a mistake. The judge looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at the document. She turned to Howard. Mr. West, the judge said, if you believed you did not understand the terms, why did you not call your general counsel? You have an entire legal department at your disposal. Howard stood up slowly, because he stammered, because I thought I handled it. So, you admit you made a conscious decision to bypass legal advice, the judge asked. Yes, Howard whispered. The judge nodded. She closed the folder in front of her. We took a recess for an hour. When we returned, the courtroom felt smaller, tighter. The judge did not waste time. In the matter of West versus West, she announced, reading from her notes, The court finds the post-nuptial agreement to be valid and binding. Howard flinched as if he had been physically struck. The court finds no evidence of coercion. The judge continued, "The husband is a sophisticated businessman who voluntarily waived counsel and actively participated in drafting the amendment. Regarding the handwritten insertion of 2.0% in Clause 14C, the law is clear. Handwritten terms prevail over printed text as they indicate specific intent. Furthermore, the ambiguity regarding the reference to Schedule B must be interpreted against the drafter. In this case, since Mr. West assumed the role of the final editor, the interpretation stands against him." She looked up. "The court rules that Harper Jackson is entitled to 2% of the total marital estate as defined by the amended Schedule B, including all vested and unvested equity in Neon Harbor Labs. Additionally, Mr. Best is ordered to pay the respondent's legal fees, given the disparity in resources and his attempt to litigate in bad faith." The gavel banged down. It was a sharp, final sound. I let out a breath I didn't know I had been holding. Naomi squeezed my hand under the table. We had done it. It wasn't just a win. It was a total victory. I stood up. Howard was still sitting there, staring at the table. Gerald Knox was already packing his briefcase, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else on earth. I walked out of the courtroom. The hallway was empty, the marble floors echoing with the sound of my heels. Harper. I stopped and turned around. Howard had followed me out. He looked wrecked. His tie was crooked. The golden boy was gone, replaced by a man who had lost the only thing he ever really loved, his status. "You did this," he said, his voice shaking with rage. "You just destroyed my life. I built that company from nothing, and you took it." I looked at him. I felt a strange sense of pity. He still didn't get it. "No, Howard," I said softly, "I didn't destroy anything. You did." He stepped closer, trying to intimidate me one last time. "You tricked me," he hissed. I stepped into his space, standing tall. "I didn't trick you," I said. "I just handed you a mirror. You were so busy looking at your own reflection, so busy telling yourself how brilliant you were, that you didn't notice you were writing your own resignation letter. You thought I was just the wife who threw good dinner parties. You forgot that I was the one who proofread your life." I turned to walk away. "Enjoy the buyout." "Howard," I said over my shoulder, "and read the fine print next time." I walked toward the elevators. My phone buzzed in my purse. I pulled it out. It was an email from Patricia Vance, on behalf of the Board of Directors of Neon Harbor Labs. "Dear Ms. Jackson, given the outcome of today's proceedings and your significant shareholder position, the board would like to formally invite you to join the newly formed Governance and Risk Advisory Committee. We believe your ability to identify structural risks where others see only power would be an asset to the company's future." I smiled. I typed a 2-word reply, "I accept." I walked out of the courthouse and into the bright afternoon sun of New York City. The air smelled of exhaust and roasted nuts. It smelled like freedom. I looked up at the skyline, at the glass towers where men like Howard sat in corner offices, convinced they were gods. They didn't know that the real power wasn't in the handshake or the speech. It was in the details. It was in the silence. If you want to call this revenge, you can. It certainly feels like it. But I call it justice printed in font size 10, right at the bottom of the page, the place where people like Howard never bother to look. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and let me know your location and your thoughts on Harper's victory. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to the Zoe Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit that hype button to help share this story with more people.